Hello, everyone. We warmly welcome you all and thanks for joining to this session. COVID-19 has laid bare the world's fragilities, as UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said in his opening statements of the General Assembly. As humanity, we are facing great challenges, rising inequalities and injustices. Leadership and cooperation are crucial to the success in order to overcome the challenges of today. We will be discussing a very crucial topic now in this keynote session, multilateral cooperation and leadership. I'm joined by Ms. Mary Robinson, first woman president of Ireland and chair of the Elders, and Ms. Jorge Moreira da Silva, Director of the Development Cooperation Directorate at OECD. Welcome, Ms. Robinson and Mr. Da Silva. Ms. Robinson, I would like to start with your opening statements first, if you allow me. Can you tell about the work of the Elders and your thoughts on the current state of multilateral cooperation and leadership? Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, and I'm very happy to participate in this section of the World Humanitarian Forum, which is looking at multilateralism and leadership. Because believe me, the elders are thinking about this a lot. We need multilateral leadership. We need to understand that we cannot solve the key problems in our world without this leadership. And yet, this is not a good time. It's a bumpy time for this leadership. So now we have the pandemic, COVID-19. And it has cut through a lot. It has really kind of, caused a total disturbance of business as usual in the multilateral system, because every country is back to basics, back to understanding how to cope with the virus. And at the same time, in a funny sort of way, we have lessons to learn from the way that COVID has undermined our business as usual. Because frankly, our business as usual wasn't taking us to a safe, good world, secure for our future generations, secure for our natural habitat of the world, secure for everything. It was actually going to lead us to catastrophe, the climate crisis, which has been hidden now behind the pandemic that we're dealing with. So we need leadership beyond belief. And if we look at the lessons of COVID, we see four things, and I will deal with them very briefly, because I know I have to be brief at this stage. We know that human behavior is the only thing that's protecting us from the virus, the pandemic, because we don't have a vaccine. And this human collective behavior will be important in the future in dealing with the climate crisis and other issues. Secondly, we know that leadership matters. And as a woman, I'm really glad to note that women's leadership all over the world, in Europe, with Angela Merkel and presidents of Norway, Denmark, Iceland, I think, and even Taiwan, but also in New Zealand. It's very interesting, taking tough decisions and bringing people with you on the science and understanding what you're doing. It's important that also science matters. And that will matter in the future. Leaders have to listen to the science. What are the children in their Fridays for Future telling us? Don't listen to us, we're only children. Listen to the science. And we are listening to the health science because we need to because of this pandemic, but we also need to listen now to the climate science. And fourthly, a subtle point, and my last point, compassion. We are all out of our comfort zone. We're in our homes. We understand the fragility now of our humanity as a whole, that this virus has just utterly upended us. And that is a lesson to really make us feel that we need a leadership that is collaborative, that understands that we can only do this with decisions at the multilateral level that are cooperative, and that You know, no country can do this on its own. We cannot deal with this virus on its own, but also we have to be aware of our fragility, which is very, very relevant in the climate context.
Thank you so much.
I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to leave the floor to Mr. Da Silva, and I would like to reiterate my question, Mr. Da Silva. What is the current status, do you think, of multilateral cooperation and leadership, and how does OECD see things?
Thank you, Feraye. It's a pleasure to discuss with Ms. Robinson and with you today. Well, as you know, my position at OECD is on development cooperation and providing support to the Development Assistance Committee. And our observation has been quite inconformistic for many, many years. We were off track already before this crisis. We were off track on SDGs. We were off track on climate, but also on financing for sustainable development. So rather than presenting a view that is only focusing on fixing the problem caused by this crisis, it's very important to take in consideration that the response to the crisis must at the same time be sufficiently compelling to fix the other crises that have been with us for many, many years, including climate and inequalities. Of course, this is even more difficult now when well, politics, politicians, civil society, citizens are very much focused on the circumstances of their own countries. And therefore there is the risk of suddenly going back to an approach that is only about national politics and national policy. So I would say that there are two eyes that it's very important to take in consideration, in addition to the four very important points made by Ms. Robinson, which is first, the idea of the interconnectedness of this crisis. It's clear that not just at the origin and the pathway of the crisis, but also in the response, we are totally interconnected, and therefore we can only fix this through a response that is global, coordinated, that can benefit from this interdependence. And the second eye, it's about inequalities. There is a false perception, I would say, about symmetry and asymmetry. Citizens may have the perception that because the crisis has affected all countries and all citizens, that the response to the crisis and the consequences of the crisis are also symmetric. And this is wrong. We know that unfortunately the poorest are disproportionately affected by the crisis, and therefore we have to provide a response that at the same time overcomes the crisis at home, but also fosters solidarity and international cooperation. And that's why multilateralism and leadership is vital. Without leadership, the response will be centered in our own interests and in the national interests. So we need moral leadership, ethical leadership, a leadership that goes beyond routine by default, that takes in consideration that we need to support our countries, same time that we need to rescue and to support developing countries and those most affected. And that's why I think that the multilateralism is not just part of the response, is the key response, and I'm really glad to be part of this discussion today.
Thank you so much. We are really honored to have you both on this session, and I'm sure the audience is greatly benefiting from this already. My next question is to you, Ms. Robinson. As you have mentioned, and also Mr. Da Silva mentioned, cooperation has been widely recognized as essential for getting through the pandemic, but this hasn't been universally accepted by all, unfortunately. And so how can we convince leaders of the importance of multilateralism if the skepticism remains?
It is an interesting dilemma in a way. We actually see that leadership matters more than ever before. Government matters more than ever before because of this pandemic. We can measure what countries are doing well and what countries are doing badly. And it's all about leadership. Bad leadership is exposed by the pandemic. I mean, it is so startlingly true. And so that in itself is a kind of message to people that they should really be angry if their leaders are not making them safe from the pandemic by having an overall leadership that trickles down to what's happening, whether it's a federal state like in the United States, or somewhere in like Brazil, or somewhere like India, or countries are not doing well if they don't have a coherent leadership. And what is that leadership based on? It's based on the science. It's as simple as that. And it has a very real lesson for the next big threat, the climate crisis. Just as leaders now in their televisions and on their radios and everything else are side by side with their health experts, most of them, guiding the phases of how we get out of this pandemic, we have to listen to the climate scientists when we are coming out of the both pandemic and climate, moving on, because the climate crisis is looming as actively and urgently. And some leaders, I have to say, did say this very well during the UN General Assembly, but not enough. There wasn't enough sense of urgency. The pandemic is terrible and we're trying to cope with it. The climate crisis will be much worse if we don't cope with it. So we have to link the two and make sure that every step we take is on the right side of reducing emissions, clean energy, clean jobs, etc.
Thank you. Mr. Da Silva, my next question is to you. With multilateral systems being undermined, unfortunately, again, at the present moment, what role can the private sector, NGOs, think tanks play to bolster multilateralism? And can this make the value come out of the crisis stronger?
Thank you. I think that if there is something that we have learned when we adopted the 2030 Agenda in 2015, is that this idea of North-South, donor-recipient, public-private is no longer a reference that should be taken into consideration. We won't fix the problems that we have on climate, but also on poverty, on inequalities, on gender, and also on this crisis without mobilizing all energy from different stakeholders. So I think that the role of the private sector, it's not just to complement national governments. We have seen an increasing relevance for civil society and private sector on the climate agenda. I've been on climate for a while. I was a member of the European Parliament more than 20 years ago. I authored the EU cap and trade scheme and then became minister in Portugal. So I've followed the leadership from Ms. Robinson on these areas. And we all know that the key issue is how to translate bold narratives into structural reforms and things that make sense, not just for consumers, taxpayers, electors, but also can mobilize the private sector in a journey that must bring added value also for the solutions that are being developed. So in practical terms, being very short, we need the role of the private sector in this crisis in ways that would mobilize the resources that we need. I'm very shocked, as you may imagine, with the fact that we managed to mobilize $11 trillion in July from fiscal packages and compacts to rescue the economies in the world, mainly the economies in the North, and ODA is just $153 billion, which is 77 less than the packages that have been developed. Am I calling for a solution that is only based on the public? No, but I'm saying that bringing the public as a catalyzer to foster the private investment is vital. We have been facing a $2.5 trillion gap on SDGs, but unfortunately the news that we get from our research and OECD are even worse. We are expecting this year in 2020 a drop on external finance to developing countries of $700 billion. And this is mainly due to drop on foreign direct investment and on remittances. So even if the public sector increases or protects ODA, we won't solve the problem without the mobilization of the private sector. So I think that it's important that leaders from the private sector also show their leadership. You know, leadership is not something just for governments. I think that the private sector leadership has been very bold, and I think that this is the moment where we also need more investment in the riskiest context. For example, blended finance. Well, blended is a trending issue, but unfortunately, only 5% of blended finance goes to least developed countries. Only 5% of blended finance goes to health and education, where the business model is not so eloquent as it is on infrastructure. So we need leaders also to take the risk, supporting those most in need, and not just going for low-hanging fruit in the infrastructure sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very informative figures, really. Ms. Mary Robinson, would you like to comment on this?
I would very much, because I agree very much with what Jorge has said. This is the World Humanitarian Forum, and we need to understand that leaders in developing countries are now dealing with the pandemic, but they don't have a huge amount of money to support workers, you know, in the way that the rich countries have done, and they are devastated. Their debt levels are huge. Capital has flown out of the developing world. So we have a new reality, a very real reality that we have to deal with. We have to deal with it with somehow, you know, even more of a humanitarian concern than we have been able to show in the past. And maybe COVID helps, because one of the things that I think is a lesson from COVID, when we're all out of our comfort zone, it does make us think. And I'm hoping that there will be more thinking about the need to remind ourselves what it is to be human. You know, we have our human rights. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says in Article 1 that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And yet we're so far away from that. What is it? Why, you know, how did we allow a kind of economy that was extractive, that was capitalist in a very greedy way, that, you know, ran the whole world? Why can we not? I'm very keen at the moment on encouraging a kind of feminist solution to our world. I think women have to be there as at least 50% of decision makers in every forum in our world if we're going to move forward. I'm having fun on my podcast called Mothers of Invention with some humor, talking to wonderful women, mainly from the South, mainly grassroots, about what they're doing, which is so sensible and so real. And, you know, we need to change the dynamic and somehow realize that COVID has taught us a lesson about our fragility, about our connectedness, about the fact that we only can move forward if we do it in a multilateral cooperative system, and we don't have much time. You know, we're in a very fragile situation. Young people have learned it, they've listened to the science, and they're asking us to listen to it too. And I'm so pleased that they're pressurizing us, and we need to pressurize governments to try to think long term, which is hard for governments. I agree, it's hard to think beyond the immediate of the pandemic and what it's doing, you know, in my immediate economy. But we have to do it in a way that actually sees us moving to the clean, green, new jobs, healthy future that is possible.
Speaking about youth, young people are recognized as important change makers at the moment, especially at a time when global leaders are not enacting change fast enough or sometimes don't act at all. What role can youth play in fostering ethical leadership that puts people first, especially at a time when a pandemic has gripped the globe? Ms. Robinson, again to you first.
Okay, well, I am so keen on the intergenerational conversation. I am so appreciative of the role that young people are playing. They shouldn't have to play this, especially the children. They're children. They should, they should be able to be children. But, as Greta said, you've stolen my childhood. And, many young people feel this, and I want them to feel hope. I want them to feel that there are many who understand and want to be supportive. There is a big future in front of them. They just need to keep up the pressure, which they're doing. Keep saying to the adults, listen to the science. Don't listen to us, we're only children. Listen to the science, which is what they're saying over and over. And if we can do that, coming out of COVID, with our recovery packages in the rich world, with our debt relief, and much more attention in the poorer parts of the world. We need massive debt relief in the developing world, because they're squeezed twice, they're squeezed many times, and they've lost the remittances from the rich world because people are out of their jobs. It's a perfect storm for them, and we have to realize that. But young people are, they're able to be in some way the citizens that really understand the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They may not talk rights language, all of them, many of them do, but in a way, for me, they represent it because they care more about those who are suffering more. They care about the small island states and the indigenous communities. I've listened to them. It's wonderful to hear how they use the connection between them for a better vision of the world. And I think we need to listen more to them. And they give me great hope.
Thank you. Mr. Da Silva, over to you on the question.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm really optimistic on that part. I think that the youth is supporting more multilateralism than others. We can see it from the surveys. So clearly, in terms of when we ask their opinion about the UN, the multilateral organizations, the role of multilateralism, the need to forge common solutions to address global but also national problems, we can see that they are much less polarized, much less supportive of any nationalist or protectionist agendas. At the same time, there is no cynicism in their perspective about climate. For example, we have seen an approach on climate that has been everybody supports climate, everybody goes to these summits, but when it goes to implementation, it's NIMBY, not in my backyard. And I think that the pressure from children, from the youth generation, from the young generations, are putting an additional pressure on politicians, on decision makers, on the private sector, because they are not just changing the political profiles, the political offer. We have seen that political parties are becoming much greener. And this comes a lot from the pressure from our children, but also we can see that also in the private sector, the consumer behavior is changing. The young generations are much greener, much more sustainable in their demands when they consume, and therefore they are changing also the supply through their huge capacity as consumers and also as in their capacity as voters and as activists. Same time, I think that we need to bring more often to the national level the discussion about multilateral organizations, international cooperation and development cooperation. I'm coming from a country, Portugal, that was under, as you may know, a rescue some years ago after the financial crisis. We had to go to austerity. And at that time, we have benefited a lot from the growth rates in developing countries, because in Europe, there was no capacity to attract our goods and services. So we benefit from the capacity from developing countries to attract and to import those products. I think it's important that we all take in consideration that there will be no growth in the North without the global growth. And this time, unfortunately, developing countries won't have the capacity to absorb the inefficiencies or the lack of capacity from the North to comply with this economic shock. So I think that it's very important that we bring to the national level the idea that supporting others is not just an expression of solidarity, something that we should do because it's ethical and morally correct, but also it's in our own interest to ensure that the recovery from this crisis will be sustainable for all, and we can also benefit from the benefits from others in developing countries.
Thank you so much. Before I start getting your concluding remarks, I have one more question to you. International institutions, multilateral organizations are facing a crisis in confidence and trust also, resulting in leaders leaving UN bodies while others threaten to defund the WHO of much needed money. At a time when we need these international organizations more than ever, how can trust be rebuilt with them? Ms. Robinson.
Yeah, the elders feel very strongly about this. We've issued a very, a very critical policy document defending multilateralism and calling out the countries that are to blame, including the United States, for leaving the Paris Agreement, for undermining the WHO, etc. So, because we're independent, we're non-political in that sense. We're not looking for any jobs or any futures. We can just be independent in our views. We feel very strongly about this, that it is important to restore faith and trust in international institutions. But in many ways, and this is something that I feel strongly myself, I haven't really discussed it with my fellow elders as much, but I feel very strongly that we need to get back to the first 3 words of the Charter of the United Nations. We, the peoples. And then you look at the structure of the UN, and there's far too much sort of protection for state sovereignty, the sovereignty of the state, even if the state is very badly led by a very bad, usually man, maybe a woman occasionally, but mainly a man. That is not good for the world. What leadership, what a president should be is a servant of the people, to serve, to protect the rights of the citizens of your country. That's what I wanted to do as President of Ireland, to serve my people. And I think that service of people, in particular protecting the poorest, etc., would change the dynamic of multilateralism. We pay far too much attention to these so-called big men, so-called powerful. Yes, they are powerful, but they are only powerful if their people let them be. So I think we need to wake people up to a power of the people to take on the populist, autocratic leaders that are, is part of the problem at the moment. And this is happening. We're seeing it in Belarus, for example. But we need to encourage this more, because leadership to me is serving the people.
Thank you so much. Mr. Da Silva, over to you.
Thank you. I would like to bring one positive note, and then sharing a lot about the concerns that Mary Robinson expressed. On the positive note, I would say that from the evidence that the OECD is collecting, we have seen an increase of members of the DAC, the donors, towards multilateralism. So the support is increasing, and this is something that is a trend that has not been affected by the crisis, by COVID. By contrary, I think that most countries are very encouraged by the quick reaction from the multilateralism. We have seen good reaction from the UN, from the World Bank. I will not mention the OECD because I have a conflict of interest, but I would say we have seen at UN, World Bank, IMF, several initiatives in the early days to provide a compelling and coordinated reaction. Same time, we are also seeing some vulnerabilities, especially in some agencies, in terms of financing and predictability, and especially the dependence on one single donor effects. We see what's happening on WHO. The same could happen in other organizations. It's not just the amounts the financial support, the scale of support, but it's also the dependence in some cases, especially on humanitarian agencies, the dependence of agendas, but also conflicts that, of course, may change in terms of priorities during the years. And this, of course, creates a lack of predictability, some instability, and reduce the capacity from the multilateral system to react. There is something that is important, that is, when we talk about multilateral organizations, we tend to think that it's the Secretariat. And it's not the Secretariat. We are talking about members. The ones that lead the organizations are the members. It's a members-driven organization. So I think it's in their own interest, or in the interest of those members, to protect those organizations rather than thinking that this is something that the Secretariat of these organizations tend to assume as their main obligation. So I hope, Feraye, that from this crisis, we will get a boost on multilateralism and on the leadership that Mary Robinson was advocating, the servant leader. I really think that this idea is the most powerful idea that we have heard from today, and I'm always glad to hear this perspective from Mary Robinson.
Thank you so much for the insightful session. It has been fantastic, and we are running out of time. We have 4 minutes left, but I would like to get your final statements, closing remarks, and your call for actions for today. Mr. Robinson, over to you.
This is a very difficult time where we have a pandemic, we have a lot of crises in our world, a lot of disruption to multilateralism. We are seeing, even in the speeches given in the UN General Assembly, the possibility of the world dividing into two, which would not be good, into a fractured world, as has been mentioned. No, we need to regroup on the core principles of the Charter of the United Nations, of the idea, as I said, of service being the focus of leadership, but also the idea of a multilateral way of coping with our problems. You know, COVID has really taught us our fragility. We're all thinking more now about life and death, about what it is to be more vulnerable. Everybody's thinking this. And collectively, we need to take this message to the highest level. Let us understand that we have 10 years to deal with the climate crisis, and then it will maybe beyond our dealing with it. We need to come out of the pandemic in a way that is green and really understanding how we move to a much healthier, much better world with green jobs, with much more equality and future. The private sector is beginning to move in this direction. I've really heard different language about no longer serving shareholders, but serving stakeholders with justice and the sustainable development goals being part of the mix. That is what we need. We need leadership at all levels. I am hopeful that the sheer truth to power of those young people who are asking us to listen to the science in the climate crisis, that will help us to navigate this difficult time into a much better, more hopeful future.
Thank you, Ms. Robinson. And Mr. Da Silva, over to you. We are out of time. We have just 2 minutes left.
Thank you. I think that the key question is whether we will use this crisis to learn from the causes and from the consequences in order to make this the vaccine to the climate crisis. I think that we had the chance for the first time to understand what is a global crisis, and I hope that we have developed and will continue developing an approach. For example, the idea that investing in resilience makes sense, and the idea that mobilizing resources alone without policy reforms and without an enabling context won't fix the problem. We are facing 3 gaps. a financing gap, an SDG gap, an emissions gap. And to fill these gaps, we also need to fill the leadership gap. So I think that this is a defining moment for leadership. I think that the pin that you are wearing, Feraye, on the SDGs is the marching orders, rather than trying to, and the same with Mary. I forgot mine in the suitcase. Rather than trying to reinvent a Marshall Plan, we know what is needed. What is needed, it's part of the 3 pillars of the 2030 agenda: the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and the financing for sustainable development. So I hope that we can go from a narrative towards action. And I would say one day our children and grandchildren will ask if we did the right thing or if we wasted the crisis in terms of the opportunity that was provided for all of us.
Thank you so much. I am proudly wearing this pin, so as Mary Robinson, and I'm sorry that you forgot yours, but we can send you one. If
really embarrassed.
Thank you, both of you, so much. I'm so honored to welcome you both on this session and as well to Humanitarian Forum. We really appreciate your contribution. Unfortunately, I do not have time to wrap up the conversation, but after the event, we will be sharing outcome reports. So I look forward to sharing my concluding remarks on the outcome report. And thank you so much once again, and thank to all of our delegates who joined and guests who joined us today, and we look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.